What's up, gamers? And yes, I know you saw the title, and I understand Jiaoqiu's sexy. He's hot. He has a fluffy tail. He cooks in the kitchen. He gives debuffs for the team. Oh my god, he makes Acheron so amazing. But you might not want to summon on him, and that's what we're talking about in today's video. Every single problem with Jiaoqiu, or as I call him, Big J. We're going to be talking about all of his negatives today, and why you as a free-to-play player, or just a player in general, might not want to be summoning on him. Because I do feel like he's kind of a weird unit, as in when you pull this unit, he plays a different role in the team, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. But first, I want to give you guys my general thoughts on Big J, and then we'll continue to all the negatives after that. So the way I look at characters, guys, is I break them down and see what they can actually do in each subcategory of the game, because the game is playing into niches a lot more now, so that's why I like to break my characters down. So let me give you the biggest three things that Big J is able to do. First of all, he gives a lot of debuffs to enemies, and then he can keep reprocking those debuffs every single time his turn rolls around, no matter if it's a basic attack, skill attack, or ultimate move. He's always going to be placing a debuff on the enemy. So that does make him really beneficial for Acheron teams. You really want people on the team, first of all, that are in agility, so that plays off of her passive and gives her a damage bonus. This also helps out Dr. Ratio teams as well, because he's able to put a lot of debuffs out on the enemy, meaning you give Dr. Ratio more damage out as well, so he plays really effectively with any like debuff-centric unit that wants debuffs on the enemies to play better. Not only this, guys, number two, he has a fire dot, which makes him viable to be used on dot team. You can throw him in a dot team, he will work perfectly fine. Of course, you're probably going to need a Kafka in this circumstance, because she's able to reproc those dots, but he does offer a fire dot to you, so that does make him viable for a dot team. And number three, he has a very unique debuff that you don't see a lot of characters have, or very much of this debuff anyways, right? And that's a vulnerability debuff, right? Meaning whenever he puts a debuff on the enemy, you make the enemy take more damage. So this is really huge in the sense that we really don't have many of this debuff in the game right now, so having him give so much of this can be really huge for a lot of teams, but it's not as good as something like, say, defense shred, right? It's almost on the level of like damage percentage or attack percentage that you're giving, but a lot of characters give themselves attack and damage percentage. Not a lot of characters put this debuff on the enemy, so this is a very scarce debuff, meaning any of this debuff that you give will be helping out in terms of your damage output. And so this for me actually puts him in a really weird position, actually, because he is good for early game, he is weird for mid game, and he's good for late game. And what do I mean by this, right? For the early game, if you don't have teams built, you can just about throw him on any team and he works, right? In the late game, you're obviously trying to build the best team absolutely possible, and you've already probably built up most of that team already, and now you're trying to just add those niche units in to really complete that team, and he is really good there. And where it's really weird at is when you get into the mid game, right? So say you have him on your account, and you don't have one of the main DPS that really take use of him, then he kind of works with like a, I guess like a second best in slot for a lot of these teams, or third best in slot for a lot of these teams, which is not bad by any means. But with the current content we have in the game right now that really plays heavily on niches, right, you really want to put like either the first or second best in slot on those teams to really get through and beat the in-game content nowadays, right? And we're going to get into that in the con section later. I'll elaborate more on what I mean by this, but overall, I think he has his pros in early game. I do think he has his pros in mid game as well, and then I also think he has his pros in the end game, and that kind of leads us into our first reason right now, because while he does have his own role for each of these sections of the game that you're in, they're completely different roles, right? Whenever you pull him as an early game player, you're pulling him just to support for every single team possible, right? Now, the problem here is you can use that through the early game, you can sort of use that through the mid game, but when you get to the end game, if you don't have a set team for him, I feel like he just falls off a lot, right? So if you're not planning on building an Acheron team, or you're not planning on building a dot team, then this kind of is like almost useless to you, right? Because as you get later and later into the game, he becomes more and more niche. And let me give you guys a good example of this, right? So let's take, for example, Gepard or Bailu, right? You might have pulled Gepard or Bailu when you first started playing the game, right? So you've had these characters, you've been using these characters for your sustained characters, but now when you're getting later into the game, it's getting harder and harder to use them, and there are just obviously better options you'll use. So let's say now you pull an Aventurine, right? Or you pull a Hua, right? You're going to be replacing that Bailu, you're going to be replacing that Gepard for these characters, because they can sustain the team better, and on top of that, they give you more buff for the team overall. So then you've kind of like almost wasted resources on these characters, because you're never probably going to use these characters ever again, right? And the same thing can be said about him. Like, the way I see him is just like that. You can even throw someone like Asta into this equation, right? So Asta is good for dot teams, Asta is good for follow-up teams with fire damage and stuff like that, right? But if you have the better follow-up team, and if you have the better characters for the dot team, you're not going to be using Asta on that team. And that's the same sentiment that I share with him, right? If you're not having him play into niches later on into the game, meaning if you're not running him on a Acheron team, and hell, I don't even think he's best in slot for a dot team, I think he's second best in slot for a dot team. He is like the replacement for the buffer on that team. If you didn't have a Robin or a Ruan Mei on that team, then you would slot him in there instead. But if you have one of those characters on the team, then he's not really going to be used there. And that's our main point on point number one here, right? Why are we pulling a character that we are not going to use in the in-game if you do not plan on building his most meta team? Because there are always going to be better options for the other team. Hell, there are better options in the game right now for those teams. You don't have to worry about power creep with him because we already have the better options. So that means when the even better options come out, he just goes down that list even more. So yes, while he's great in early game, while he's decent in mid game, and while he can be really great in end game, that's not to say that he is viable for every single team. So if you're not planning on building those teams, there's not really a point here. And that kind of leads us into point number 2 now. And that is there's almost always someone better than him, right? Let's go ahead and take a team like a follow-up team, right? He works really good with Dr. Ratio, like I mentioned before. If you don't have like a full follow-up team, then he's going to slot in great to work with Dr. Ratio if you planned on using a Dr. Ratio team. But then when we start adding those more meta characters for that team, like a Topaz, which helps out tremendously with a follow-up team, and then when you add a buffer into the team, like a Robin or even a Ruan Mei, he just kind of falls off the cliff. You're not going to use him anymore, right? Like, he is good on those teams, but he is not the best for those teams. Therefore, whenever you pull the better variant of that team, you are not going to use him, meaning you have now wasted resources on this character. We can even bring up an even better example here. Dot teams. Guys, we already have Kafka, we already have Black Swan, we already have a sustain character. Where does he really fit in on that team? Sure, you could throw him in as a buffer, right? He does offer fire dot to you, and he also offers a pretty unique debuff that you can put on the enemy as well. Sampo is also someone that offers this debuff for all dot characters, right? And I think he is a pretty massive upgrade for Sampo on these teams. But we already have Robin in the game, which enhances attack, which then inherently enhances the dot they're able to do as well. And whenever we get a new dot character added to the game that's able to reproc dots again, you're not going to use them on the team at all, probably. He's just going to be dumpstered. You're not using him anymore on the team. And that's what I mean. There is always going to be someone better than him. So while, yes, you might find great use of using him in the early game, he's just going to become less and less and less relevant the more time goes on in the game. Because if you're not building for those meta teams that he is best in slot with right now, then there's really no point of pulling him unless you just like him, right? And honestly, it's so sad to say this. I'm going to make a video talking about this. Like, in the game now, it's coming to the point where you can't even really say waifu over meta anymore because the meta is becoming so niche nowadays that it's so hard to pull the characters you want because they don't work for necessarily every single game mode anymore. So it's even hard to like recommend waifu over meta nowadays. We're gonna make a video on that in the future, but that's just something I want to get out of there. It's pull for who you want to pull for. Just know that it might not be the best case scenario for you. And then in that same vein of someone always being better than him, there is always going to be someone better than him with debuffs as well. Sure, he offers vulnerability, which is a very rare debuff, but defense shred is better. Pela's debuff is just better, right? He can do more than Pela overall, right? Like putting fire down the enemy. He probably outputs more DPS than Pela can, right? You're always going to be using Pela for the most part on an Acheron team, right? Like, so you would probably put Pela, Mr. Big J there, and then Acheron. Unless you have her E2, then it's probably just Acheron Big J because he does enable so many debuffs on the enemy that you can supercharge your ult faster. Now, let's say this, right? What happens when we get a unit that works similar to him, but gives defense shred? He's dumpstered there as well. Like, the thing is, with these characters, what they need to do, if they're going to make a character like this, they need to give him a stronger variant of a debuff. And yes, I get it. We don't have this debuff in the game at all at a very high value, right? And so I think he has his own place in things right now. And I don't think he'll get power creeped on, let's say, an Acheron team in a while, right? But when that day comes, where is he really good at anymore? He is just second or third best in every single team from now on, and you'll probably just never use him whenever you get to the in-game and the in-game meta, right? So with him only being like really viable or the best in slot for really 1 to maybe 2 in-game meta teams right now, I just can't really see any use of recommending that you guys pull him because you want to be getting the most bang for your buck on your account, and I don't see him as doing that. Now guys, I'm not saying that he cannot beat in-game content with other teams. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying as in-game content progresses and gets harder and harder and harder, him himself is going to become less and less relevant because you're going to want someone better on that team to enhance that team even more, right? So when he comes out, I think he'll be fine, right? I just think he's a very power creepable unit. I don't see him having much longevity, even though he is like a very niche unit, right? Like, I honestly share the same sentiment with Sparkle as well. I only think Sparkle is as strong as the only crit-based damage dealer in the game, and right now, if you don't have E2 Acheron, that's going to be Dragon Danny and Jingle Yu. So when they release a new character of that, then I think she goes up in value, right? I think the same thing could be applied for him unless they release a defense shredding monster that kind of does the same thing that he does, right? Like, if they release a better Acheron, then his value goes up with that, right? They have to be scaling off of the amount of debuffs you're putting on the enemy as far as their ult goes, but if you don't really have that, then you kind of lose that whole structure altogether, and then what is he really left with? He's left with Fire Dot, enemy vulnerability. That's really it. I mean, at the end of the day, right? He's only left with 2 of his main things anymore. Anyways, and then the final thing I want to touch on here is the banner. We're getting Hook Arlan and Gwen. Gwen, arguably the best character on this banner over here. She works very similar to how he works. He's like a direct upgrade to her, okay? But the overall value of this banner here is really not much. You're not, what are you using Arlan on? Let's be honest, guys. What are you using Hook on at this day and age? Come on, like, really nothing. Gwenithan is the best character on this banner by far. I've been praising Gwenithan since she came out. I think she's an absolutely amazing unit because I think she's very similar to Mr. Big J in a way, is she's a jack of all trades. Gwenithan does basically the same debuff that he does. Gwenithan gives a fire debuff on the enemy, and then Gwenithan can practically do a debuff every single turn. The only thing that she's really lacking other than him is the ultimate move. His ultimate move is absolutely massive for putting debuffs and stacking debuffs on enemy, so obviously in that vein that she is still more viable, but I don't think she really falls far behind in like general like debuffing use cases than he does. Like obviously his debuff is better than hers, and his fire dot is better than hers, but in the grand scheme of things, I really don't think she's that much worse than him, honestly. So, I mean, even if you just got her on your account, I think you would still be fine in a lot of scenarios. But the main point here is, if you're a free-to-play player, you shouldn't be wasting your Stellar Jades on a banner that's not giving you much value for the featured 4 stars on the banner. I think the next patch will be a lot better in terms of that. We've kind of got all the fodder, like, 4 stars out of the way as far as reruns go in these last 2 patches, or these last 2 characters we've gotten. I genuinely think 2.5 is really going to be good with the banners that we get there. So I honestly just think it's worth waiting for 2.5 rather than summoning on him, right? Like, I think he has his team. I think he can work on that team. I think he can work on a lot of teams, but I think he's going to get power crept very easily, and you really don't want to be pulling for a character that can get power crept more easily than someone else in the game. Anyways, gamers, that's going to do it for today's video. At the end of the day, pull for who you want to pull for, right? If you like the big, sexy Fox man, then pull for him, right? I mean, I'll probably attempt pulling on him. I haven't gotten the last few characters. I just spin my Stellar Jades as I get them now. If I get a character, I get a character. If I don't, I don't. So that's how I've been doing it recently. Anyways, that's going to do it for today's video. Subscribe if you haven't already. I know this weird dislike bomb like it normally does, but whatever. I like doing these videos. I like talking about the negatives of characters. Anyways, see you guys later. Bye.